All right. So, defense policy update. What do we know, and what's this all about? And if we go back to, in fact, it was at the Ottawa conference that we had the former deputy minister, who was then serving as the national security advisor, uh, who offered that she felt that considering the external changes in the environment, or in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We've got the whole issue of investments in defense. We're seeing kind of some of the holes in our own capabilities, and concerns, obviously, about what's going on in Europe, and a bit of introspection. Germany's kind of decision to really plus up. So all of that was in the mix in terms of an update to Strong, Secure, Engaged, and so in the budget, it really wasn't too much of a surprise when the budget came out, announced a number of measures for defense. There was a very widely publicized $8 billion, which was announced in the budget, which raised a little bit of eyebrows, because it seemed like it was already money that had been previously programmed. Not a lot new there, but what they did say, what was new in the budget, was the announcement of basically a defense policy update. The institute, we offered. There was a lot of criticism that what was announced in the budget was far short of what might have been anticipated, considering some of the build-up towards this. And but if we're going to be optimistic here, hopefully it's going to be with the government taking the opportunity to justify any future increases in defense beyond Strong, Secure, Engaged, beyond the $8 billion, that would match basically government's consideration of what and how the government sees the world changing around us. So, what do we know about the defense policy update at this point? Well, not very much, at least not publicly, and that's not too surprising at this point. I think they're doing their work on the inside. In terms of timing, from I think what we've gleaned from different sources, is that they're looking at something to come out in the fall. And so, what would we think, at the CDA Institute, the major issues that go into kind of a refresh of Canada's defense policy at this point, based on our expertise? And I think with Gord and Darren, both who had instrumental parts, Gord for the overall policy lead in framing Strong, Secure, Engaged, and Darren, who really was representing the military input into that defense policy work from his former role as Chief of Force Development. So, in terms of telling our story here, maybe Gord, you can just even, remind us in terms of a little bit of the story about SSC, from how that work was kind of initiated, launched, its kind of beginnings, and how it came to fruition. Just to kind of set the tone in terms of the general theme of how defense policy in general is made. And I think that would be part of, as we try to explain things, to help educate folks as well on the defense policy making process.
Yeah, sure, Guy. So just a couple of things to distinguish what's going to happen in this process relative to what happened the last time. And the key word is update, obviously. I mean, last time it was the first, root and branch review of defense policy that had taken place in a very, very long time. The predecessor document last time was CFDS, which hadn't really been a defense policy, as we know. The Canada First Defense Strategy was a shopping list more than it was a policy, and the word policy didn't even appear in the title. It was called a strategy precisely because it didn't have the heft and the integrity to be described as a policy. So the word policy was used very deliberately in the writing of Strong, Secure, and Engaged. So in one sense, that's makes it easier, I think, for the guys who have to do this exercise. They don't have to start from scratch. They have the existing policy. The existing policy was intended to have a 20-year lifespan, although everybody understood that it would have to be updated along the way. And now we're about a quarter of the way through the lifespan of that document. So it's perfectly natural and normal that you would need to have an update and a review on it. Um, the In terms of some of the key things that were done last time that they're going to want to make sure they touch base on at the outset, I would flag two. One was the overriding concern with costing, making sure that the costing of every option was credible and well done. And of course, I think that was a success, as evidenced by the fact that nobody has really seriously questioned the costing of anything in it over the last 5 years. So that's been a big thing. And then the other thing that was done last time that was of critical importance was the early consultation with allies. Um, so less so the Americans, because they weren't in a position to go down some of the roads, and we were out of cycle with them. They had the quadrennial defense reviews, but unfortunately, during the process of SSE, they also had a transition in government. Donald Trump became the president, and suddenly the quadrennial defense review was thrown out the window, and so that didn't work. But the consultations with the other Five Eyes members were all very productive and very useful, and important things were learned from those processes, from the Australians, particularly on costing, from the New Zealanders on public consultations, and from the Brits on the how you fit the whole question of a defense policy review in the context of broader public policy, A-based reviews. So there were some very valuable lessons learned in that process. So those are lessons I think that they will not want to lose in the current exercise. There are three things I think that the update will probably need to focus on, and they're fairly obvious. The first one is the updates that were pretty much predicted in the original document, and the critical one there is renewal of North American defense. So at the time of Strong Secure and Engaged, it was acknowledged that we're not in a position to do this. You can't do Strong Secure and Engaged by yourself. I mean, you can't do a review of North American defense by yourself. You have to do it with your partner. The partner, as I've talked about, partly because the transition to Trump, but partly because they just weren't in the right spot on the cycle, weren't in a position to do that work jointly with us, although NORAD did some great legwork, but they weren't in a position to take that forward. So we just had to punt that one down the road, and I think we did the right thing. We said, look, we're not prepared to do this now. We'll have to do it later, but you're going to have to come back to this. And so very understandably, we're now in the situation where that's what they have to do. The second thing that they're going to have to do is take a look at how we've done implementing in the first quarter of the life of the document. So the document had a 20-year lifespan. We're about 25% of that time under the way. And this gets very much to the points that you were making a second ago, Guy, which is how have we done rolling it out? And there are some obvious points there where we maybe haven't done as well as we would hope we would in the first 5 years. One of the great advantages of SSE was that we went to an envelope spending model, which allowed us to take money that we didn't spend in one fiscal year and be able to move it forward and be able to draw on it again in the future, which was tremendous. It gave us a lot more flexibility in terms of planning and spending, but it does eventually catch up with you. If you keep pushing expenditures forward into the future, you're eventually going to get to a point where you can't possibly spend all the money in the required time frame. And so there are probably some serious questions there. And I just flagged that as one example, but that's the second class of issues. There's the ones we predicted, and then there's the ones where we need to adjust in terms of our own performance to date. And then the third class of issues that we have to look at going forward is going to be the result of things that we could not have predicted, the things that happened that have changed the environment. And I think there are quite a few of these that have happened, and nobody's going to, I think, blame us for not having had a crystal ball and predicted those. But there, a lot of them are out there. So just off the top of my head, and I'm sure you guys could come up with more pretty quickly. Um, the Ukraine invasion, massive change in the geostrategic environment. The the much more aggressive position of China with respect to Taiwan, which has changed the geostrategic environment. Um, the Related to that, but also specific in its own right, what happened with respect to submarines. The whole French Australia deal falling apart, the Americans stepping in, that has a particular resonance for us because we did deal with the issue of submarines in SSE. We did not. I read some commentator who said, "Oh, they didn't deal with this last time." That's not true. We did deal with it. We just made a very conscious decision not to buy any in the next 20 years. Well, that may not be the right decision anymore. Not because we made a mistake 5 years ago necessarily, but just because the situation has changed dramatically. So that's a third one, and then the fourth one, which we regretfully have to acknowledge, is that the issue of sexual misconduct is a lot different now in the sexual misconduct in the forces than it was 5 years ago when SSE was written, and it's going to be, if the update doesn't make reference to that, people are going to wonder who's been asleep for the last 5 years. So those are the type of issues that are out there, but I think they do fall into those three categories.
Darren, we can turn to you for a little bit. And again, we're looking a bit retrospective here to start about what went into Strong, Secure, Engaged, because it sets the tone for where we are today in 2022, 2023, looking at the Canadian Forces and how well positioned they are to deal with especially as Gord said, the things that we didn't predict. And from that perspective, maybe you can just talk a little bit about how the Canadian Forces input, how military input is provided into defense policies, defense policy discussions from your unique position that you had as Chief of Force Development when SSC was being developed.
I'll start just echoing just a few things that Gord had mentioned. For example, when we did it in 2016-17, it was a greenfield. It was developed within a baseline, whereas now this effort is a brownfield effort, playing from the guardrails that have largely been put in place. And as Gord mentions, the word update is key to that in their mental frame. So there's time and notice to prepare. I don't think anyone should have been reasonably surprised that at some point there would be a defense policy update. And I know from conversations with colleagues that they were working on that, but that was a fundamental difference in when we were putting things together. And in some ways that made it easier, and in some ways that made it more difficult. And as Gord mentions, there's a number of to-dos. I would add NATO to that. I agree 100% with the idea of needing to substantively address the issue of professional conduct inside the military, and make sure that continues to evolve and as rapidly as possible in the most positive of ways. There are other objectives in the context of social procurement and government policies that will need to be considered in the way that the policy is implemented. And to Gord's point, that being his one of his key 3 points was how have we done in the execution of that, and how do we need to adjust the policy. But to your core question, ultimately, Guy, when we were looking at this, we had to get an agreed start state, because all evidence to the military's mode of operations is that everyone will look at their own defined authorities, responsibilities, accountabilities, make an assessment of what is absolutely necessary from their point of view, and it will be done without truly deep regard for the other constituents at the table. So when we're thinking about the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Joint Capability Set, and the like, everyone is going to be looking at it from their perspective, because that's what they're charged to do. And so the first thing that was necessary was to create a common understanding amongst everyone of where the strengths and the weaknesses of the Canadian Armed Forces were, which would serve to create a shared vision and a shared understanding of the areas that needed to be invested in. And it might not be mine; it might be hers or his, and that fundamental start point was I think an essential building block to success in terms of getting consensus around the approach and the type of options. With that shared understanding of where all the capabilities in the Canadian Forces were in their life cycle and when they would time out against a 20-year horizon, that created an understanding of the phasing of investments that were needed to maintain capabilities. And that's not replacing a vehicle with a vehicle, but that's replacing armored mobility with something. And it might be armored mobility, or it might be a more advanced armored mobility, but it might be something different than armored mobility, to use an example. So we kind of went through that process, and as Gord also mentioned, a collaboration with allies was essential, and we did a fair amount of collaboration with the United States in the context of interoperable capabilities from a North American and a NATO context, and we connected with a number of NATO partners and with Australia and New Zealand as well, with similar intent in mind, just to exchange both policy considerations as well as military capability requirement considerations. So all that wove into an assessment of what was needed when, and in some cases we had a good idea of what was needed, and ground-based air defense is a good example of that. Whereas in other cases we knew that we would need to replace our space-based surveillance of space capability with something. And we knew that something could be a ground-based, could be a space-based, it could be any number of combinations of that, it could be commercially provided. And so we went through a lot of thought process around that phasing over a 20-year period of investments. And then established by the ADM of Finance was a very robust costing capability. And so as we were going through these capability needs, we started to create portfolio options, which each of these capability areas was discretely costed against an understanding in time of when it would be, because when you consider defense and industrial inflation and you consider other factors, you had to layer contingency the further out it would be to try to affect an understanding of what its cost would be. And as Gord pointed out, and I'd like to double click on that, the success of engaging with the Department of Finance in bringing the substantive elements of the policy into an accrual framework meant that we were able to do this in a much more significant, holistic, and captured way. But it also meant we had to demonstrate to finance that we were serious about coming with credible costing, because that has perennially been a problem for national defense. I think the ADM of Finance, Claude Rochette, was very successful in bringing forward a credible costing paradigm where we had a costing framework that was reviewed by a competitor organization to validate its costing probity. And those layers of validation to the methodology meant that there was such an increase in confidence that they were willing to take it into an accrual framework. So we had an understanding of the start state. We had an understanding of the phasing of investments over time in capability areas. We had consulted with allies to kind of round that out. And then that created portfolio options, which we were able to frame and bring to the Chief of Defense Staff and to the Deputy Minister for consideration, understanding. And then we started to socialize those, and those became the basis of the documentation that Gord's team would have prepared and brought for Cabinet's consideration.
So, Gord, when you talked a little bit right at the beginning about strategy versus policy, and there's been a lot of discussion about, how can you make defense policy in the absence of connecting it broadly to a national security strategy and perhaps kind of linked together with a foreign policy. And one of the things I think which is true that the linkages between the major functions in government to be able to deliver and to really fully align has been one of our historic, I think, challenges here. So can you talk to us a little bit about what was done from your perspective leading the SSC piece with the other government departments. I'm thinking GAC in particular, but other departments like PSPC, and delivering on the actual capability ambitions of SSC would necessitate looking at fundamentally how we acquire capability, how we work with industry to do that. And so just wondering, as we were setting what we want to do with defense, how it linked to those other kind of policy areas which defense didn't own, but obviously had to influence.
So foreign policy is almost, of all the other departments, this is sort of qualitatively different. It's much bigger and it's much more fundamental, because as we knew last time and as they know this time, we don't use the Canadian forces abroad except as an expression of Canadian foreign policy. So how do you figure out what you're likely to need to use them for if you don't have a foreign policy framework? It's a big problem. But that being said, what we did last time and what I think they will do this time, and by the way, Pete Hammerschmidt asked me the same question a few months ago, is this. There are two ways to make foreign policy. You can do it deliberatively, or you can do it iteratively. And deliberately is the kind of thing that happens very rarely in Canada's history, although more commonly than defense policy. So something like Canada in the World, which was the big foreign policy document that the Chrétien government issued, is an attempt to look at the big picture and put it all down on paper and say, here's what we're going to do. The other way you do it is you make it up as you go along, in effect. And what you can do, and what we did with SSE, and which I'm pretty sure they're doing now, is you then have to assemble your own foreign policy from the iterative parts. And it's a little more challenging, but it can be done. So there are places you go to look. So you go to look at the budgets. So you would take a look at the budgets of the last 5 years and you'd say, okay, what language did we use in the budget and in the budget speeches that actually relates to foreign policy events, and what kind of funding was put forward? So we know we can draw from that the little gems and the seeds that we can put into this. Throne speeches are another example. There's usually very little language about foreign policy in throne speeches, but what there is can be very significant. Sometimes you're lucky if you get a paragraph that addresses foreign and sometimes defense policy in the same paragraph. But if it's there, that's where you get the hooks that you need to attach elements of your defense policy to. Then there are the public statements that the government makes. So a speech in the House of Commons, the annual speech to the United Nations General Assembly, which is made every year either by the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister to the UNGA in the fall. There are and then public speeches to audiences across the country, and then things that are said by the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister in the context of their regular conversations with other government leaders. One of the key things that came out after the election of Joe Biden as president of the United States, as a readout of one of their very first phone calls, was the decision made by both leaders to put North American modernization on the table, which is exactly what everybody thought needed to happen after the end of the Trump era. So you can read into the you can read Canadian foreign policy in those decisions. And if you watched, the network news last night, then you saw that the German Chancellor was here yesterday, and there are all sorts of statements there that can be read backwards to help you define what Canadian foreign policy is with respect to both Western and Eastern Europe. So you can. It's a lot easier if you have a document that you can just pull off the shelf and say, here's the Canadian foreign policy. But if you go through all of those little steps, you can iteratively come up with some sense of what the overall policy is going to be. And I'm sure that they'll be doing that. And there is, of course, still that one speech that the previous foreign minister gave just before SSE was released, which I don't think has ever been. it was made way too late to influence the last policy, but now it's the opposite. It's 5 years out of date to influence the update. So who
Yeah,
knows who knows how useful it might be, but you can still
yeah,
take a look at it.
yeah.
Um, I would just note as an aside that I understand Marta Morgan resigned in the last few days, and that's very interesting and might mean that there are some changes coming uh, with Minister Joly. I don't know why it all went down there, but I note that the one element of foreign policy that we really thought we would have by this point was the statement on the Indo-Pacific,
Yeah,
and it's still not there.
yeah,
So how that plays out, especially in a context where at the moment, you got Cindy Termosheisen acting as the as the as the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, is going to be a very interesting thing to see. So all of that to say that there's going to be there's there's there are ways you can go forward, but there are also going to be some real challenges in terms of figuring out foreign policy. The other issues that you raise, I think, are qualitatively less fundamental, but they are um, but they're definitely there. So there's all the issues around the relationship between national defense and national security, and the role of public safety in national security. And these um, these are really tricky, but the crosswalks are really clear. So you think of all the other departments who play a role in here, and some of the things that we have to worry about. So export controls, foreign investment restrictions in Canada, um, Canadian foreign investment abroad, uh, the end use stuff on export controls. There's a lot of areas of public policy here where where we're going to have to be where they're going to need to stay plugged in, um, and a lot of that's going to come back to China. Um, I don't worry about that too much because there are processes in place. I think there's a real question around the adequacy of those processes to actually come to agreed interdepartmental positions on national security. Um, but uh, of a defense policy review. It's unfortunate maybe that it's beyond the scope because it probably really does need to be addressed. But I don't see how they could possibly do that. You'd have to sit down and bring all of the parties like Industry Canada to the table, Foreign Affairs, which is responsible for export controls, and others. And I suspect that once again it won't get dealt with because it's just too broad to encompass under the heading of that policy. I guess the one thing that we didn't touch on there, we should probably do it now because we might otherwise, is the link beyond national security issues to stuff that other government departments are doing that will have an impact on the policies it rolls out. The two that obviously come to mind are climate change, which is going to have a big influence on how the Canadian forces get used domestically, and certainly since SSE's concerned, we've seen that happen dramatically. Floods, fires. Just look at what happened in British Columbia last summer and the summer before. There's going to be greater and greater recourse, and we're going to have to figure out with public safety how we deal with those issues. And that's not even mentioning domestic use of things like the Canadian Forces going into nursing homes to deal with pandemics. So all of that may need to be brought up in a update context. And then there's the Aboriginal issues too, which are not going away in any way. And as we know, there's a particular role for the Canadian Forces in the north there, which will continue to be brought up. And then there's all the land claim stuff, an awful lot of which infringes on lands that are currently under the jurisdiction of the Canadian Forces.
Darren, coming to the start state kind of consideration. So you're in the CFD, and one of the challenges is to get everybody, on the same sheet of music as to, what the what the missions and expectations are of the Canadian Forces, and how well you're adapted today, and where the gaps are, and what you need for the future, and getting everybody more or less aligned on that. And you have to make assumptions, and I know one of the things that General Vance, the chief at the time, was really keen on, in addition to kind of the overall making sure we got the costing right and we've got a good start date, was the output. It was kind of, what's the size of the Canadian Forces we need on a sustained basis for persistent presence, and in the enduring kind of roles of sovereignty, the defense of Canada, the continental defense, the work that we do in conjunction with the United States, primarily through NORAD, but not exclusively, and then, of course, our collective security contributions. And so, it was kind of do the math. So we've got kind of, this is what we're doing here in Latvia, this is what we've got in small missions, this is our kind of commitments to NATO, this is what we need for our continental obligations with the United States under NORAD, and then do the math, and then it's kind of a simple way to get the discussion going about the size of the forces. And what I would wonder about, Darren, is in terms of some of the fundamental decisions that the Canadian Forces arrived at. As Gord said, it wasn't that we didn't make a decision about subs. We did make a decision about subs. Whether it was the right decision about subs, that's a different question. But the bottom line is, if you take things to the extreme, we could take the entire appropriation for the Canadian Forces and just throw it at Canada's north, the Arctic, and we still wouldn't have enough to do it all by ourselves. So we've got this problem where we are trying to do a lot with the Canadian Forces. We have to make some choices. And so I'm just curious whether or not, Darren, in terms of the assumptions that we were making about the choices that we had in these option packages, what was seen as being the crown jewels, had to really protect it, and things that we say, look, in the future we can't do it all. So where's the trade space? I guess I'm trying to come to in an elegant way. And did we trade anything in strong, secure, engaged? Did we say, hey, we're not going to do this in favor of doing this, or is it just strictly to the government of Canada? Look, it's all needed. We all need more of it, and we need more in specific areas. I'm just kind of curious if you can walk through a little bit of those kind of discussions that were going on for SSE.
So we did two things concurrently, Guy, that shed light onto what the portfolio needs going forward were after we had an agreed start date. And we did a regression analysis where we looked at the last roughly 35 to 40 years of Canadian Forces activity, the frequency that things happened, the size of the missions. And you have to always keep in mind that that's not what we would want to do, but that's what we were able to do in the day. So there's a bias built into that methodology because you really are inside your force size. But when you still consider surges and size of missions, that generated, generally speaking, for all the types of things that Canada had been involved in for the last 30, 40 years, missions were of a certain size. They tended to be more often, and then that led us to, in the concurrency of operations model, to say, we sometimes do things episodically, a very short mission. Sometimes we do things in a sustained way, and we do kind of larger things, brigade minus brigade maybe, and we do small missions, a couple of hundred folk. And when we looked at those optionalities, that seemed to bear out over like 40 years of activity. And the bit of the anomaly is when you send clusters of ships, because they come in groups of 240, and you send them in for a certain number of days and out, and so that was a slightly different calculus that was paid to that particular service. But generally speaking, I think that bore out well. What I would do, kind of looking forward, that we were not able to do or did not factor in as well, and I'll pick up on Gord's point about the variety of things that the Canadian Armed Forces are asked to do. And as a taxpayer, I think that's good use of capability. Do I think provinces should be able to do it more consistently with provincial resources rather than resort to federal support? Probably, but nonetheless, when you have it, you should use it. But what we would probably imagine a chief of defense staff today going is, okay, we're asked for these things. We have to build in to our force structure the ability to respond to these things in a way that doesn't prejudice our ability to meet Canada's international defense needs. Yes, we would support domestic local, but we would be able to act international in a way that wasn't prejudicial. And the chief of defense staff of the day said, well, that's where we're going to leverage the reserve. And I think there was a sensibleness to that. And I think it's borne out a lot because the timing of these things tends to actually incidentally line up to availability of resources from the reserves and the general level of training and confidence and military acumen needed to do a lot of these domestic tasks also lends itself to the reserves. That doesn't, of course, speak to the long-term healthcare facility task that required a certain number of medical practitioners, which aren't found in that.
Yeah.
I guess, if I was to just speak on the size of the force, one of the challenges in our decision-making process as a new Westminster system is we tend to be asked to solve a problem, and we bring forward recommendations for consideration with some interactive dialogue before at staff levels, at senior staff levels. But in this kind of a choice space where when we were doing the original defense policy, we were looking at a force that was smaller than 68,000, if we needed to, a force that was 68,000, and what would be a growth area. And that was the box that we had. Now I think the chief of defense staff would say, okay, there's nothing that tells me I need a force that's smaller than 71,500, the approved defense policy size. So do I need a larger force and to do what? And so looking at those concurrency of operation mission sets with the reality of war in Europe as a potentiality, with the reality of rules-based international order reinforcement in Asia Pacific being a potential need, what are the capability sets? What are the size of force that I need to be able to attend to these types of more extreme force package needs and sustained needs? And that would lead, I think, a chief of defense staff to assess force size, given continental defense, given all these other factors that might need to be larger than 71,500. Is it 80,000? Is it 90,000? Honestly, Guy, I only a practitioner would be able to know. But I can tell you with confidence that, and cabinet confidence aside, that the level 61,000 or 71,500 that the Canadian Forces was authorized to go to was not accounting for everything that the Canadian military would need.
Gord, you wanted to just jump in on that?
Just two quick points. The first one, with respect to the size of the forces, I think that's a really good example of the stuff that falls in the second category of issues that I was referring to, where I was saying in the update, we have to take a look at performance to date against the objectives that we set for ourselves.
Yeah.
And because I'm pretty sure that when we check those numbers, we're going to find our performance to date on size of the forces isn't very good. And so the question is, why have we failed over the first 25% of the life of this document to address a problem that we so clearly identified and which cabinet gave us the authority and the resources to solve? We didn't, right? We didn't address that properly over the last 5 years, and doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. We know what that's called. So there's that's one of the issues where we have to really figure out where we're going. The second thing I would just say, and this is getting back to your comment, I remember those conversations with John Vance about do the math and how we get there, and he had a solid point, but it comes up against the problem in the final analysis of having to give cabinet and ministers optionality. You can't go to ministers and say, this is the solution, you have to do this. You have to be able to give them one option. And if you say, well, we've done the math and the math leads you to this answer,
right,
and therefore you have to have it. And this was a particular problem in discussions after SSE, in conversations with NORAD, who were saying, well, we've done the work, here's the checklist, you have to buy all this stuff. And you say, okay, and if you don't get that option, what are options 2 and 3? And the conversation stops because there was no analysis of what the other options would be.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. And I do think that's where, when you look at the enduring problem for Canada in this space is, we live next to a superpower. We Canadians don't feel inherently threatened by,
Yeah.
certainly military traditional kind of threats. We're a long way away from the other borders of countries where you're dealing with issues of migration and terrorism and all that spills across borders. But we're not obviously unaffected by all of this unrest we see in the world. And, this issue of, Gord, when you said that the employment of the Canadian forces overseas, of course, is always in fulfillment of foreign policy objectives. And some folks actually say, well, that's all the discretionary stuff. The government ultimately has the discretion to decide whether we're going to do this, we're going to go to Latvia, how much we're going to spend there, how much we're going to do anywhere in the world. But what's not discretionary, of course, is protecting Canada and protecting Canadian sovereignty and Canadians at home. So this issue of, what I find really interesting on this aspect of discretion from a government of Canada's perspective when it comes to the Canadian forces, they even use the language when it comes to the defense appropriation. That's, we spend the government's spending on defense is categorized in part of the discretionary spending of the government of Canada. All the rest of this stuff is kind of that which is under the law, in terms of the transfer payments, the health payments, all of that, which is the government has to pay those bills first. And then out of the rest of that is where defense gets its budget. And it's a big chunk of that discretionary spending. But, issues of defense and security shouldn't be ever described as discretionary. It should be kind of fundamental in terms of the government's obligations. So let's turn then. I mean, we've already talked a little bit about it, but maybe we can talk a little bit more about play the role. So, Gord, you're now the deputy minister, or maybe you're ADM Paul. You've talked to Pete Hammerschmidt. I don't know if you talked to Bill Matthews, and you have a good sense. So, if you're the deputy minister right now, with the world changing around you, you've got kind of what you described earlier, in terms of the issues that. Whether it be China's increasing aggression, hostage diplomacy, kind of acting in ways in which they're using more aggressively their military might, kind of a view that we need to be more relevant in Asia Pacific. We got Russia and a whole unimaginable. A couple of years ago, this was unimaginable. I mean, Crimea happened in 2014. That was a bit of a shock. But what's gone on here is another whole level of magnitude. The issues of pandemics, lockdowns, increasing domestic unrest. So you're the deputy minister of national defense. What would you want? What are the 3 or 4 things that you would really be pushing and want to see from a defense policy update based on your consideration of the world around us? And Darren, I'm going to give you the same thing as the chief of defense staff as well in a moment.
So 2.5 things.
All right.
Because, as you know, when you're the deputy minister of defense, your principal concerns have to do with budget, and do you have enough money to do what you need, and how much you have to ask for, and that's where you really come into the process. So the greatest driver of the 2 great drivers of the budget are going to be the changes in the geostrategic environment and the domestic use of the forces, both of which have the potential to change dramatically. On the geostrategic side, what you're seeing right now, and this is where it would be lovely to have a foreign policy, is the true globalization of conflicts and the interrelationship between them. So what you see now that is clearer than probably it's ever been before in Canadian history is the fact that problems that are at opposite ends of the globe have a very direct impact on each other. What China does in Taiwan is going to be very much affected by what Russia does in Ukraine. And they're going to talk to each other. And if China decides it's going to do something more aggressive, it's going to do that because it feels that the environment is permissive and they can get away with it because of what might happen in Ukraine. And the same is very true on the other side. If China were to do something horribly aggressive in its region, that's going to make the Russians feel much more confident about how assertive they are in their own region. There's only so much that the community of the willing democracies can deal with. The real foreign policy issue that needs to be addressed there, and it's really difficult, beyond Bill Matthews' concerns, is the whole question of the adequacy of multilateral fora. NATO doesn't have a mandate to take a look at what's going on in Asia, at least not much of one. And the United Nations Security Council can't deal with problems like Taiwan and Ukraine when Russia and China have a veto. So the whole future of where you get legal ability to intervene in the geostrategic environment is a huge issue that needs to be dealt with. And actually, Dick Fadden and I are going to a meeting in London in September, where I think they're going to have our track 1.5 discussion around those kind of things. But that's a really big really big question. So if I'm Bill Matthews, I'm worried about what are the geostrategic drivers that are likely to affect the budget over the next 10 to 15 years, and you can see some really heavy demands. The second major driver I think that we're going to have to worry about, he's going to have to worry about, is domestic use of the forces. There is every indication that climate change is just going to keep driving up that demand. I agree with Darren about provincial resources would be great, but it's just not going to happen. The provinces are strapped themselves completely, so they're going to continue to look to the Canadian forces, and it's going to be floods, it's going to be fires, but those are going to lead to related greater demands, like search and rescue. There's going to be greater demand there too. So that's got to be. If I were Matthews, I'd be pulling my hair out, saying, "My God,
too late for you there."
Yeah, too late for me. But what are they gonna do about this? I mean, how are we gonna predict this? Because it's just, there's got to be some kind of contingency built into the system that says, okay, in moments of tremendous resource, whether it's a pandemic or a flood demand, there's got to be some contingency in there that allows you to address those kind of concerns. So I think that's the big one.
You said 2.5, so
we're actually that's 1.5.
Okay,
so I'm saying that the geostrategic environment is the big thing, but you can't ignore the domestic. That's the half.
Okay.
But the second big thing that you're Bill Matthews and you got to worry about is going to be procurement, and that's why Bill's in the job right now. He's got the absolute perfect background, and he's done exactly the right things over the last 6-7 years to be the guy with this issue. Because even if you get the resources, you got to be able to spend them effectively and bring them about. And he knows that. He knows what's expected of him. But he's going to have to find some way to move the needle on procurement. And he's going to be stuck with the same issue that all the other deputies have had, which is you can't solve this problem by simply moving all the responsibility for procurement into the Department of National Defense. No one wants to be in a world where the forces have no check and balance on their ability to spend money on their own things, on their own goods and services. So how do you allow for that check and balance to be in there? There's some kind of a challenge mechanism in the process of buying things, and yet still allow for that money to flow more efficiently and quickly, and get out the door when there's a great need. So I would say that those are the two things that probably are keeping Bill Matthews awake right now.
Okay, Chief of Defense Staff, Darren. What do
So
you
I'll,
think?
I'll imagine a chief of defense staff who had been a CFD, because I'll put a little bit of spice
Yeah,
to
that's
for
right.
those things. If if I was in the first instance thinking of the DPU and what was really good that I don't want to sacrifice from the first process, and what things I would want to buff up to make better. Um, the approach of taking a portfolio approach that was reinforced with solid costing underpinnings and that was framed in a decision support way, so that leaders had optionality, to Gord's point, which I completely agree with. The leaders had optionality, and they were able to see the trade space so that they could make an honest, sound decision based on need. So I would keep that. I think the approach and the investments as planned for the Royal Canadian Navy and the RCAF, notwithstanding the submarine deferral of decision, which we absolutely did characterize and consider properly, and made the decision that within the lifespan of a 20-year policy was not needed, and that a defense policy update would, at the appropriate time, bring forward a decision related to recapitalizing submarines. I think the RCAF, well positioned, understanding that there were going to need to be investments associated with NORAD. So RCF absent investments related to NORAD, such as the North Warning System, such as certain space-based capabilities that would be needed, et cetera, that we knew would be planned. So that configuration is in a good place. The fact that there's a public-facing investment plan is an attribute that I would strongly advocate for, and that there is a repeated upfresh to that, because in the end, if you don't refresh that document, industry is not in a position to be supportive and responsive. Then the research and development would essentially double down on what the idea program built out, because I think that actually is seeing fruit being born in terms of addressing problems for the Canadian forces. So I would probably double down on that. Things I would look to reinforce in the approach would be, the Canadian Army cannot be looked at in a disaggregated capability, piecemeal capability type of way. It needs to be looked at in more of a platform and scalable platform concept in how it's configured. So I think that intellectual stroke would be necessary. I think special forces need to move towards a more deliberate, continuous improvement or continuous investment model, because they need to have that confidence that they can operate in that way. In a similar way, I think the information management and ITI backbone needs a continuous investment paradigm, as opposed to large signature technology projects, which government history informs are typically not successful. I think on an infrastructure point of view, we have to recognize there are three areas in the infrastructure environment: that's the operations of the railroad, the light repair associated with the infrastructure, and then major upgrades or recaps. And so we need to have funding mechanisms that align to all three of those realities for the policy. I don't think the defense policy in the first instance really looked at command and control as a capability in terms of the applications and decision supports needed to support military to civilian leaders. And so we need to, is it an application? Is it a way? Is it but we need to actually consider that as a way to communicate securely with leaders wherever they are in the world, because the decision isn't going to wait for the prime minister to be in a specific room to get information. That man or woman could be anywhere. Then I would, and then I'm just going to quickly shift to just a couple of things. Key is we didn't really look at medical capacity and climate change, which are two wildly different things. I appreciate that, but just saying that those two things deserve some special consideration. And in climate change, that speaks to what we buy, but also how we buy it. In other words, the impact of military capabilities on the environment, minimizing that impact, and also what we buy, because the climate change environment will require us to be able to operate differently. If I was the chief, I would be focusing on the concurrency model and making sure I have a futured understanding of that, grounded in a future security environment. And do I need to make fundamental adjustments to that based on what we're seeing in Europe and what we're seeing in the Asia Pacific theater? I would be very seized with the Five Eyes placemat reality, and be talking to senior political leaders about how that is core business for national defense. And if we are not able to invest politically in that relationship, then it will cause us issues that we will become concerned with over time. And then I would be focused on my intelligence apparatus in terms of what's happening in the Ukraine and the South China Sea in the context of what that could mean for us in the future. And are we investing sufficiently in our ability to understand and sense and collect information? That's open source intelligence and other related capabilities. And finally, Guy, I won't mention much on procurement. Gord has spoken to that. I would say instead of talking about it being inside national defense or not, we need to really meaningfully do something about it. And there are several solutions to that, but I mean meaningfully do something about that, because no one has meaningfully tried in a long time. There have been lots of process adjustments and improvements, which have been countered by layers of check, whether it's the independent defense panel, independent review defense panel, or others. And then finally, it wouldn't be right to not conclude on reconstitution and culture, because the Chief of Defense Staff, and I think Gord alluded to it as well, the Chief of Defense Staff is going to need to deal meaningfully in a sustained way with the professionalization of Canadian Forces culture, and that will be delivered in part through an approach to reconstitution.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and support that last point, Darren, because I was going to make that point too. I don't know whether it's top of mind for Bill, but I bet you dollars to donuts that Pete Hammerschmidt is telling him, if you want more resources out of the update, that you're going to have to address that issue, because there will be, people at the political level who are making that crosswalk, who are going to say, you want to give more resources to the forces, you're going to have to demonstrate progress in sexual misconduct. You're going to have to demonstrate progress on extremism in the forces, because otherwise, we can't politically justify this. So I think that's a real issue. And then this is just a small thing, but I something I hadn't thought about, but that you quite rightly pointed out about medical capacity. That's a really interesting one, because I was talking about it earlier in the context of domestic deployment. But you're absolutely right. In a world of pandemics, that's going to fall into both my second category and my third. How have we done, actually rolling out the improvements in medical capacity that were promised in SSC? I don't know. I'd be fascinated to see that. And then secondly, in the third category, how do you go beyond what was promised last time to actually deal with the problems related to deployment in an era of pandemics and monkeypox?
I do think that everything you've described, both Gord and Darren, points to more, not less. And I think this is a big challenge for the institution, because it's very fragile right now, in terms of its ability to try to sustain operations, to grow the force, to recapitalize the force, to deal with culture. It's I can't imagine what that must feel like on the inside right now. I've got my own kind of experience as a vice to know that it was a busy time trying to do a lot, and this is an extraordinary time for all of the things we've talked about. So they've got a huge challenge, and I think I think Gord, you said it, we can't keep doing the things that we've always done. If recruiting and we can't grow the force, the last thing I think we should be doing is throw more people at the recruiting system. We've got to kind of find new partners to work with to actually help us deliver on things and use our capacity to do the things we're best structured to do. And that's why I think the issues of procurement, or the issues of working, with research and development and working with industry, is really going to be the only way that we're going to confront all these things in a way where we're going to see the progress we want to see. So that kind of thinking as well, I think, is hopefully on people's minds as they look. Because when you say, Gord, you said it, like, why have we not been successful, say, in growing the force? I do think that the question is who's we in this context, because it's not just the Canadian forces. Canadian forces are enabled by government policies and Treasury Board policies and working with the other partners, and so the collective we, sometimes it's all just thrust on, I don't know, the Canadian forces that are from national defense, where be successful in achieving the policy objectives really does require a whole government approach. So I don't know if others kind of will be pulling with the forces as they kind of come in this next cycle. But it's a big challenge if they've got to try to do all of this at the same time, because just each one of these issues is more than all consuming. And you had your hand up. I don't know, Gord.
Yeah.
Darren.
I was just going to say, Guy, that if I go back to 2010 to 2014 period, where we knew we national defense, we knew that CFDS was not an effective policy structure. We knew that the funding for the Canadian forces was not where it needed to be, and we knew that every year we were consuming a year's worth of the capital residual life in every asset across the Canadian forces with no meaningful sustainment plans in place. Today, there is a way. The government took a decision and agreed a defense policy in 2017, and they are updating a defense policy. So there is a structured way. While it's significant as terms of work, that's, for me as a former practitioner, that's very heartening that there is a way. That's not to say there aren't enormous challenges of delivery, of realizing it, of choice space, of what you feel you professionally want versus what you need. But I think that's like fundamentally a more positive situation to find ourselves in.
Yeah.
And one very short point on recruitment and placement, because I do agree that there is another way that this could be done. Well, what I would say is in 2016 and 2017, we were at 100%. We had recruited to 68,000 or so, or 67,500, to the point where we were doing an analysis: would the deputy minister get in trouble if month we actually exceeded the number? And we came to the conclusion that it's on the balance of the fiscal year that we would have to make that measurement. And so, but what's also true is we probably had 2,500 of those individuals who were on strength who were not functionally effective. So we were still in a challenging space. But of course, the pandemic did a lot of damage to the economics of the country writ large, and no less so the Canadian forces, in terms of why we see now the significant numbers and shortages. And Gord's highlighted that, and I totally support it. That we have a real challenge that cannot be ignored, and it's multifaceted because it's on the human dimension, the cultural dimension that we spoke about, and it's on the ability to reconstitute Canadian forces in terms of numbers of trained effective strength.
Yeah.
And that's the pandemic is not predictable, and it is what it is. But it doesn't mean that that they cannot deal with it in a truly meaningful way.
Well, and I think that kind of leave it there, but it does fit, Gord, into your the three things that the update needs to focus on. It's that middle number 2 point that you had in terms of how we're actually how we've done against what we said, and so it gives us an opportunity to kind of rethink as well, and reflect on that, and hopefully come with some new thinking, or perhaps old ideas that we had that just never really took stock, and they remain good ideas. We just need to kind of put it in motion. So with all that, thanks to both of you for joining, and Jane for bringing us together, and